We need breathing room.
Earth, Hitler, 1938.
I beg your pardon.
Are you sure it isn't time for a colorful metaphor?
When we last looked at a Star Trek film, it was The Final Frontier, where it was torn apart from an artistic standpoint. In order to understand what happened with the follow-up, you also need to be aware of how the film fared financially, which is, it bombed. Not as bad as other films have, but compared to other Trek films, it hadn't done well at all, and it cost much more to make than any of them had. Part of that was due to its competition, Indy 3, Ghostbusters 2, Lethal Weapon 2, and the theatrical juggernaut of Tim Burton's Batman certainly hurt. But at the same time, let's not forget that Star Trek V had the biggest opening up until then, and if it had not failed creatively, it probably would have done much better. After all, 3 of those 4 films I mentioned were sequels. Let's also remember that many box office flops go on to greatness later on and surpass films that had originally beaten them at the box office. The Princess Bride certainly has done much better than Nuts. John Carpenter's The Thing has done much better than Tootsie, and Army of Darkness has done a hell of a lot better than Stop or My Mom Will Shoot. Anyway, I continue to bash Star Trek V because it is relevant to the plight of Star Trek VI. If you look at the Star Trek film budgets and their grosses, it shows a very simple trend. If the last film did well, the budget went up. If it did poorly, the budget went down. So after Star Trek V, with its huge budget, did poor, there was a question of whether or not there would even be another Trek. And when it did come, it was budgeted for much less. Why is that relevant? Because with each sequel, the experienced actors and creative people were getting more money. The expense of doing things was going up, and suddenly producer Leonard Nimoy and director Nicholas Meyer were stuck with a budget that made it literally impossible to produce a film, significantly less than Star Trek V, and would have fulfilled Shatner's fear that he'd killed the series had it not been for someone else coming in to take over Paramount that knew Meyer personally and agreed to give him as much as Star Trek V so that the film could get made. Harve Bennett's original concept for Star Trek VI was to get around the budgetary problems by not including most of the original cast and having Shatner and Nimoy with very small roles. It'd be a story about the crew as cadets and showing how they had originally come together and then left, only to be reunited on the Enterprise eventually, and would have shown the reason for certain things, like why Kirk never settled down, because the woman he really loved was lost. Oddly enough, this idea was welcomed, just not for Star Trek VI, which Paramount felt needed to be a cap to the Trek 25th anniversary and had to include the main cast. They asked Harve Bennett to do this film, but it was on such short notice, without even a concept in place, that he felt it was just time to bow out of Star Trek. So Leonard Nimoy came in to produce and brought Nicholas Meyer back to write and direct, as he did for Star Trek II. He told Meyer that he wanted to do the wall coming down in space, and the line, "Only Nixon could go to China." I was born in 1973, which I think is close to the youngest you could be to appreciate the significance of the events that transpired at the time Trek VI came out. Through popular culture and news, we, that is, the children of that time, knew early on that we lived in a world divided between East and West, that the sides were basically evenly matched, that we would never give up our freedoms, and they would never give up their drive towards expansion. If you went back in time a quarter of a century and said that within 5 years there would be no Berlin Wall, that the Soviet Union would dissolve without conflict, that there would no longer be an East or West Germany, but just Germany, it would have seemed like the ramblings of a madman. It isn't as if it dominated our daily lives or anything. It was simply that which was always there, a backdrop. That world is so different from that of today. Now, if I think about conflict with the Russians, it's that one of them is going to show up in the comments section of one of my videos saying, "Star Trek is good, and you are gay, and a fag." The first half of the 90s largely reflects this realization that the world was no longer what we thought it would be, from the decline of the military-industrial complex to who should now be the default bad guys in fiction. It was change, and it's no surprise that that idea is embraced in this, the last story of the original Enterprise crew. The end of their era. Speaking of ending an era, this was the last film that Roddenberry presided over before he died. He despised a lot of Starfleet's continued militarism, the prejudice of some of the humans, and the portrayal of the Klingons. Few of these things were changed since he passed away and no longer lobbied for them, obviously, and the final film was dedicated to his memory, which when you think about those two facts side by side seems almost cruel, doesn't it? Still, it was exactly what the studio wanted. In fact, it went over so well that Brandon Tartikoff, newly appointed head of Paramount, couldn't believe this had to be the last one with the original crew because it seemed such a surefire winner. Nevertheless, this would be the last time we'd see McCoy and Uhura, and the last time we'd see the group together. As discussed last time, you often have to make allowances for budget even when it won't match the film that you want to make, so our chance for an opening with the crew being reassembled for this last mission, which would show their fates and why they would be so eager to come back to Enterprise one last time, was lost. Scotty would be banging his head against a wall trying to understand the cloak on the stolen bird of prey. Uhura would be hosting a talk radio show. Chekhov would be trying to defeat higher life forms with superior Russian chess strategies. McCoy would be surrounded by insufferable doctors, and Kirk would have been pulled from the arms and bedside of Carol Marcus from Star Trek II. While fun and exciting, the roundup scene would have been pricey, so Nick Meyer rejected it when the budget problems were brought up to have money for the more essential parts of the film. The results spoke for themselves. Star Trek VI went on to greater success than its predecessor, both with the critics and the box office. While its competition wasn't quite at the same level of film juggernauts like those I mentioned before, this still contained a plethora of big-name films as direct competition. Hook, JFK, Beauty and the Beast, The Addams Family were all extraordinarily popular films at that time, and Star Trek VI held its own with them, coming in as 15th in the box office for 1991, which was a year that also included such giants as The Silence of the Lambs, City Slickers, and a little film called Terminator 2. So the film begins with a bang, specifically the moon of Praxis, which will soon kick the ass of the Excelsior. It's finally managed to leave space dock thanks to its new captain, Sulu. The man's certainly gone up from getting lost in the woods and looking at Klingon ass to captaining the most advanced ship in the fleet. They spend 3 years exploring gaseous anomalies in the Beta Quadrant, which brings them near Klingon space. And you may insert your own joke here if you wish we were having more beans and bourbon lines like last time. Oh, so they want us on Voyager, huh? Well, I was hoping to hold out for the next generation, but... So the ring coming from Praxis slaps around the Excelsior, drawing their attention. Checking out the moon, they discover the whole thing's been reduced to one large chunk. So Excelsior quickly offers aid, given how severe this catastrophe is, but the Klingons tell Excelsior to stay away. There was an incident, but everything's under control. The inspiration for this bit was no doubt the reactor incident involving Chernobyl, which was perhaps the most notable precursor to the fall of communism, and like that will be the precursor to the end of hostilities between the Klingons and the Federation. At a briefing, where our heroes are brought in for one last hurrah, Spock says that thanks to the incident, the Klingon Empire has only 50 years of life left to it. It seems the accident happened due to overmining and insufficient safety protocols. Yes. Obviously, anytime you blow up a moon on accident, your safety precautions were probably a little bit insufficient. I mean, that's a hell of a screw-up. What are you doing up there? Juggling antimatter warheads? Playing plutonium bumper cars? It's hard to imagine anything could do something this huge without being the result of deliberate gross negligence. Like they have a sign up somewhere celebrating 428 days without a workplace apocalypse. So Spock reveals that Chancellor Gorkon, indicative of an idealized Western view of Soviet Premier Gorbachev, wants to discuss terms of peace with the Federation so that they could dedicate their efforts to recovering from the devastating effects this will have on their homeworld's environment. Though if they can accidentally blow up their own moon, I doubt Kronos is a picture of environmental friendliness right now. Admiral Cartwright objects, saying that they should let the Klingon Empire collapse so that they'll be in a better bargaining position, one that Kirk backs up vehemently, saying the Klingons just can't be trusted. Spock says they have to act quickly to support this plan, known as the Gorkin Initiative, or else the Klingons might ignore the environmental problems and leap straight into war, also known as the Glenn Beck Initiative. The other bombshell is that Enterprise will be the one escorting Gorkin to the peace conference, which shocks the hell out of Kirk.
We volunteered.
There's an old Vulcan proverb. Only Nixon could go to China.
It's a good joke, but it also establishes the obvious reasoning behind having someone who despises and is despised by the Klingons involved. Nixon, whom most of you know as the bad guy from Futurama, was a vehement opponent to communism, and yet was the leader who ultimately worked to improve American relations with Communist China. Only Nixon could go to China because only someone who was clearly not a sympathizer could hope to do so and accomplish something. Likewise, only Kirk could go to the Klingons and show on both sides that an overture of peace was genuine. Only problem is, Kirk doesn't want to.
They are dying.
Let them die.
That remark, slipping out in a moment of anger, illustrates the obstacle that must be overcome. I wasn't the only one who grew up in the shadow of the Cold War. The generation before mine had done so as well, and for far longer. And when the idea comes of ending it after so long, of actually trusting our enemies, that may be demanding too much. For Kirk, it's even more personal. The best way, in my opinion, to watch the Star Trek films is to start with 2, then 3, 4, and finally 6. In it, we go full circle. Kirk begins by his birthday making him feel far older than he is, and now when he genuinely is older, he will eventually have to realize that he must overcome old ideas. Likewise, Kirk was reminded of what he'd given up by staying away from Carol and David, and then finally recovering so that he can have back what was taken from him, only to then have it thoughtlessly taken away by the Klingons for no reason. That wound hangs over him and colors his judgment so that he can allow himself to utter such a sentiment.